Why not?
Okay. I'll start without an
Please.
introduction. I think you know who I am. I'm Peter Buckley. So let me just start on this. I'm going to talk today about the disruption to the world economy and the particular issues around globalization. We know we've had a major shock from COVID, but this is actually one of three shocks that we've had, because the second one is the change in the political position and the change in rules and regulations, that some of which we've been hearing about just now, about protectionism and nationalism in the world economy. And the third shock is the rhetoric against globalization, in particular pointing out the people who've lost out to the effects of globalization, the so-called left behind. So those are the issues I want to look at. I want to look at the background to the fracture in globalization, and I want to look at the strategies that multinationals do and will put in place to do this. So first of all, one of the major changes, one of the key things that's happened is that a previously fairly united world economy, a globalized economy, has become fractured largely by government policies. So government policies have started to break the world up. I mean, the world was never fully integrated. We never had a completely flat world. But what we did have was a system where global value chains could be allocated freely across the world according to cost and efficiency and strategic concerns. But what we have now is very much more a nationalistic agenda, and we have the world fracturing into separate blocks. One of the issues is so-called strategic industries. Now, initially, strategic industries concentrated on things that we would really call strategic: defense, communications, energy, perhaps, things of that kind. But what's happened is that the definition of strategic industries has become much more wide, and security concerns have been expressed about parts of the economy that weren't there before. And so foreign direct investment in these industries has become much more difficult, because the argument is you have to go through vetting, you have to go through procedures. If you're in the wrong camp, and we're thinking particularly of the split between so-called Chinese influenced areas and US influenced areas, you have to go through a lot of hoops, you have to have a lot of security clearance, and often you're barred from investing in these industries. Now, this goes together with a very serious concern about the world economy, and that is the underlying conditions of doing business across the world were based on the assumption that we would have a single internet, that we would have a global internet, that the systems that I use in Britain would be the same as are used in China or Japan or the US, and the internet would be a free flow of information and communication, business knowledge, and so on throughout the world. This has been broken in the so-called splinternet. The Chinese introduced the so-called Great Firewall of China, and there's been an attempt to insulate individual internets from so-called foreign interference. So political interference in the internet has resulted in the companies, multinationals, not being able to rely on single systems that go across the world economy. And this has very serious impacts on their strategies and on the way they can configure their global value chains. The third point on this slide has got China in quotes, because often the picture of China that is presented is often not the reality of China, but the idea that China will be a massive threat and a massive disruptor to the world economy. And some people refer to this as the othering of China, making China seem like an entirely different kind of civilization. And this leads to the idea that we have systemic competition. We no longer have in this view the idea that firms compete, or indeed that there is an industry in which people cooperate and compete. The idea is that different systems are competing. So the Chinese system, largely state-driven, state-owned companies, centrally controlled, is actually competing with the more open, market-driven companies internalizing activities and externalizing through contracts in global value chains from the West point of view. Now we have systems that underpin this too, the Belt and Road initiative from China and the digital Silk Road, which reinforces the arguments about the splinter net, and the Build Back Better system that the Americans and the West are going to challenge the infrastructural ambitions of China in the rest of the world. And this means that on both sides, the West and China, if we can refer crudely to those two camps, the role of the state is much greater. And this has been reinforced by COVID, by the interventions of the state in providing mass vaccinations and lockdowns and all the policies that go with it. So there we have a set of factors that lead to what I call the fracture in the world economy. The fact that the multinationals and we as analysts cannot assume that there is a single integrated world economy. Before we made that assumption with various frictions, with the idea that there were tariffs and there were other barriers, but nevertheless, that multinationals cannot assume that there is a single environment out there. And when we come to this idea of competition, we have a kind of different philosophy here. We have the idea of openness and markets going back to Adam Smith, but we also have the idea of national competitiveness going back to Liszt and the rise of Germany. When the world economy was dominated by Britain, Germany had to compete within that and had to get its own area of international competitiveness. And you could argue this is a model that China has followed, saying that we wish to build a national system that will compete globally. And so industrial policies are very much linked to the idea that the national is the most important thing. So we're not looking at foreign direct investment necessarily as a means of reaching other markets or a means of globalizing. We're seeing foreign direct investment as a means of strengthening the domestic national economy. And that's quite a change, and that's quite an issue. And where you have state-owned firms that are carrying out implicitly or explicitly national government policy, you have a set of very different decisions from those made by what we might call traditional multinationals. In addition to this, the rise of the national has led to lots of attention on those people who have not gained from globalization. There's plenty of evidence that there are groups of people centered in individual locations, which makes them politically strong in those locations, and in particular industries. I'm thinking of the Rust Belt in America and the old cotton and wool towns in Britain, where vast amounts of people feel left behind and therefore react against globalization, feel that it's something that has benefited other people and has not benefited them, not relatively and possibly not absolutely. So a real political push against globalization, and this is of course fed by the rhetoric of politicians such as ex-President Trump, who plays to this idea that people are left behind by a global elite who should be countered. In addition to this, we have a move towards reshoring. I've seen a term recently called friendshoring, where you make sure that the whole of your value chain is within political friends. And what this can lead to is to exacerbate the fracture that I talked about. So value chains within political areas dominated by China or dominated by the US. So the reshoring, the argument that there will be massive amounts of reshoring in the short term has not yet happened, because it is very difficult to reconfigure global value chains. It's particularly difficult to reconfigure them and reshore them away from China, because China is has so many of the characteristics: relatively cheap labor, hardworking labor, conducive environment, good infrastructure, good trade links, until they were severed, of course, in part by security concerns. So reshoring has not been that easy. In addition to all this, we have the rise of the platform economy, the rise of multinationals who dominate a platform and then use contracts to bring people in. So we have a different balance between location and internalization, the two key drivers of multinationals that we had before. So international competition is undergoing quite a radical change. And now, what about the strategies of multinationals? What does this mean for the strategies of multinationals? And here the time factor is absolutely crucial, because multinationals are like huge oil tankers. They can't change policy in a minute. They have to plan, they have to work things through. So I've looked at the strategies of multinationals in this scenario in terms of these four time periods: immediate imperatives, short term, long term, and what I call long term, or the very long term. So in the very short term, we have multinationals are very concerned with issues of safety, issues of liquidity, and issues of continuity. Business continuity is very important. So when the pandemic struck, the concern was for the safety of the company to keep liquidity and to maintain continuity by things like building up inventories. So the short-term strategies in an emergency, immediate imperatives. In the short term, the key thing for multinationals in planning their strategy is, of course, to collect and to disseminate information. Not only the collection of information, but the dissemination of it within the firm. So all the decision makers have access to the right kinds of information. And planning, corporate foresight, trying to plan the way forward in these difficult and changing circumstances. Now, in the long run, which is, I think, more or less what we are particularly concerned with, the change in the world economy, the threats from COVID and other pandemics, the threats from the fracture, mean quite an interesting set of changes in potential policies. Re-evaluating aggregation strategies. Are all our big activities we heard earlier about changes in where you locate things, are they all aggregated and in the right place? Employing country difference strategies. So within the sort of safe places to place our global value chain, what are the key differences? How can we evaluate where best? These are locational factors that we need to reassess because they are changing over time. There'll be a certain amount of reshoring and disinvestment. Although, as I say, these things are not immediate and they're not easy to do. And this will force multinationals to think about their organizational structures, even their head office. Is the head office in the right place? We saw with Brexit that there was some consideration of where the head offices are under political changes. These kind of things are very important. It is possible for multinationals to change nationality and change head office, but particularly change in their organizational structures. Building resilience. We hear a lot about this in value chains, including training, including flexibility. Multinationals need to be flexible. The two key factors that drive multinational strategy are innovation and flexibility. And then the possibility of firms moving to multi-domestic organizations. So instead of trying to build a value chain that crosses many countries when you've got these problems, what you try to do is to replicate your domestic organization in a number of different polities. This was a strategy that was popular some time ago, but with globalization developing, it was much more efficient to have a, quote, global value chain or a global system, or as I call it, a global factory, rather than have individual freestanding organizations. That might become, again, more popular as the fracture in the world economy and other problems occur. Regionalism is clearly going to be very much more on the agenda as the world economy fractures into regions. So a step down from, or a step up from multi-domestic strategies is to have regional headquarters and to look at the world as made up of individual regions and giving the regional headquarters the power to set strategy within those regions. So we have regional strategies, and we also move much more to regional value chains. Peter Enderwick and I wrote an article on regional value chains recently. So the reconfiguration of value chains has to take account of these changes in the world economy. In the very long run, or the long run, we might see two rather surprising strategies. One will be maybe to bifurcate the world economy, so we have parallel systems, and maybe we have the same firm operating parallel systems in the so-called Chinese sphere of influence and in the American sphere of influence. And we may also see, and I've written a couple of articles on this recently, the rise of cartels, the use not of ownership, but of agreements whereby you're not tied into ownership, but you have agreements across these systems, which make it easier to coordinate activities. As we've said, national policies are becoming much more important. The rise of the national, and indeed the original term international business, international, is becoming much more important. Layered on top of this, we have the concerns arising from the pandemic of the biosecurity state, where another argument for kind of protectionism, for a different kind of protectionism, is biosecurity. We might add to that food security. A lot of countries are getting concerned that a lot of their food is imported, and this might be interdicted by political change. So there are strong pressures building, again, the argument of the state. Now, what about global governance? Global governance through the UN and other multilateral and international organizations has been crucial. And the key role of global organizations is to deal with externalities, is to deal with, try to correct externalities. And where we have the rise, and this is something else that's another pressure on multinational, the rise of environmental, social, and governance goals, so-called ESG goals, international organizations are in a great position to do something about this. If we think of climate change, which is a massive issue that I haven't even mentioned yet, we think of climate change, really the only way this can be dealt with is at international level, because individual nation, you always got free riders and people who don't comply. So there is an argument here that strengthening international institutions is actually a good thing for the world economy. But of course, it's extremely difficult where we have the rise of national power and people aggregating national power to themselves. So we've got a real kind of geopolitical issue where for the good, for the welfare of the world, we need to do more for international organizations and international governance, but this is extremely difficult. Global governance then is to deal with, as I say, social costs and externalities, and to try and do something about monopoly. The other point that perhaps should be made is that a lot of the regulations in some ways are captured by multinationals. So enforcement of global governance is going to become an issue in the future. And finally, I realize how quickly I've gone through this and how little time I've got to deal with some enormous issues. Multinational enterprises need to rethink their strategies in a hostile world. That's not to say they will change their activities tomorrow. We've talked about the time sequencing of this. Some things need to be done quickly. Some things can take time. But I think what I've tried to show here is that the circumstances, the external environmental circumstances facing multinationals are changing, and therefore strategies and global value chains have to change. We need to think about the rise of the biosecurity state, the food security state, and all the issues that governments are facing, and ask how compatible these are with a free trade and global economy. And this is really a major issue for the future. And finally, we have to look at the arguments against globalization. I've highlighted the left behind, the people who feel left behind, but there's a lot of rhetoric against globalization that may have impact on multinationals. So multinationals have not only got a strategy job to do, they also have a kind of PR or non-market strategy to try and correct some of the problems that they face, in the hope that we can continue to have the most efficient set of global value chains, even though these are bound to be constrained by the changes that I've outlined. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't have more time because there's some very big issues there. I hope we can talk about them in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and suggesting speech. I'm KUWANA from Oberlin Universities. I should have introduced Professor Buckley to you, but I didn't unmute. So there is miscommunication. So Professor Buckley is a world distinguished professor as well as scholar in the field of international business. So maybe it's not necessary to introduce him to you, but let me say a few words. As you know, he has held a lot of important posts, including president of AIB, Academy of International Business, chair of IBAS, European International Business Academy. In addition to those, he is also one of 3 foreign fellows of our academy. Thank you. So I'd like to hand over Professor Hasegawa, who is the moderator of the next session.